A cold wind howled through the mountain pass as Arabella Sinclair clutched her tattered shawl tighter around her slender shoulders. The golden sunlight was fading fast, taking with it any hope she had of finding her way back to civilization before nightfall. Panic rose in her chest as the shadows deepened around her, stretching like ghostly fingers across the rugged terrain. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Just keep moving." It was 1876, and the Colorado Territory was as beautiful as it was deadly. Arabella had only wanted a moment of peace, a brief escape from the suffocating confines of her aunt's home in Silverton. What was supposed to be a short afternoon walk had turned into a nightmare when an unexpected storm rolled in, obscuring the landmarks she'd been using to navigate. Now, as darkness descended upon the mountains, Arabella realized the gravity of her mistake. No supplies, no proper clothing, no light, and worst of all, no idea which direction would lead her to safety. Her boots, fashionable but entirely impractical for mountain hiking, slipped on loose stones. She tumbled forward, crying out as her hands scraped against the rocky ground. Pain shot through her palms, and she felt the warm stickiness of blood between her fingers. "Stupid, stupid," she muttered, fighting back tears as she pushed herself to her feet. The last dying rays of sunlight disappeared behind the jagged peaks, plunging her world into darkness. Arabella had never known such complete blackness. Even the stars and moon were hidden behind thick clouds that promised more rain. She took another tentative step forward, then froze as the distinct sound of a twig snapping echoed through the silence. "Hello," she called out, her voice small against the vastness of the mountains. "Is someone there?" Only the wind answered, whistling through the pines that surrounded her. Arabella hugged herself tighter, trying to ignore the growing cold that seeped through her thin dress. She had to find shelter. The temperature would drop dramatically overnight, and without protection, she wouldn't survive until morning. Blinking back tears, Arabella forced herself to move forward, hands outstretched in front of her like a blind woman. Her fingertips brushed against rough bark, and she followed the line of trees, hoping they might lead her anywhere that might offer protection from the elements. The first droplets of rain began to fall, cold and insistent against her skin. Arabella bit back a sob. This was it. She was going to die out here, alone and forgotten, all because she'd wanted a moment of freedom. Then, like an answer to her unspoken prayers, she saw it, a faint golden glow in the distance, flickering through the trees. A light. Hope surged through her veins, giving her renewed strength. Arabella stumbled forward, ignoring the pain in her feet and the rain that was now falling steadily. The light grew brighter as she approached, and she could make out the outline of what appeared to be a small cabin. "Hello," she called out, her voice breaking with relief. "Please, is anyone there? I need help." She reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, its windows glowing with the warm light of a fire within. Arabella rushed to the door, her heart pounding, and raised her fist to knock. Before her knuckles could make contact with the wood, the door swung open. A tall figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light from within. Arabella stepped back, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. She was a young woman, alone in the wilderness, at the mercy of whoever owned this isolated cabin. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she stammered. "I got lost in the mountains, and I don't have a light or any supplies, and with this rain, you're soaked through," the man interrupted, his voice deep and raspy, as if unused to speaking. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in before you catch your death." Arabella hesitated for only a moment before the intensifying rain made her decision for her. She stepped inside, the warmth from the fireplace immediately enveloping her like an embrace. The cabin was small but neat, with a simple wooden table and chair, a narrow bed in the corner, and various tools and supplies organized along the walls. A pot bubbled over the fire, filling the space with the rich aroma of some kind of stew. The man closed the door behind her and turned to face her properly. In the light, Arabella could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of days spent outdoors. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking shade of blue, like the sky after a storm has passed. "Xavier Irving," he said, offering no handshake or further introduction. "Sit by the fire. You're trembling." Arabella realized he was right. Her whole body was shaking, partly from cold, partly from fear, and partly from the sheer relief of finding shelter. "Thank you," she managed, moving closer to the fire. "I'm Arabella Sinclair. I got separated from my path when the weather turned. I feared I might not survive the night." Xavier nodded once, then moved to a small trunk at the foot of the bed. He pulled out a worn but clean blanket and brought it to her. "Your clothes are wet. You should change." He gestured vaguely toward the blanket, then seemed to realize the impropriety of his suggestion. "I'll step outside while you make yourself decent." Before Arabella could respond, he had grabbed his coat from a peg by the door and slipped out into the rain. She stared after him, bewildered by his gruff manner, but grateful for his unexpected chivalry. With trembling fingers, she peeled off her sodden dress and petticoats, hanging them near the fire to dry. The blanket was surprisingly soft as she wrapped it around herself, its warmth a blessed relief against her chilled skin. A few minutes later, a knock sounded at the door. "Are you decent, Miss Sinclair?" Xavier called. "Yes, thank you," she replied, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Xavier re-entered, rainwater dripping from his coat and hat. He hung them back on their pegs and ran a hand through his damp hair. "Storm's getting worse," he said, moving to stir the pot over the fire. "You're lucky you found my cabin when you did." "I think perhaps it was your cabin that found me," Arabella said softly. "I was completely lost until I saw your light." Xavier glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You've found me," he said simply. "That's enough to keep you alive tonight." Something in his tone made Arabella shiver, though not from cold. There was a story there. She sensed a reason why this man lived alone in the mountains, far from any town or settlement. "Do you live here year-round, Mr. Irving?" she asked, attempting polite conversation. "Xavier," he corrected. "And yes, for years now." He didn't elaborate, instead focusing on ladling the stew into a wooden bowl. He handed it to her along with a spoon.
"Eat.
You need strength." The stew was surprisingly good, rich, venison-flavored with wild herbs. Arabella hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. She ate eagerly while Xavier watched from his seat on the edge of the bed, a respectful distance away. "Where were you headed?" he asked after a while. Arabella paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Back to Silverton. I'm staying with my aunt there while She trailed off, not sure how to explain her situation to this stranger. "While you what?" Xavier prompted, his voice gentler than before. "While I decide what to do with my life," she admitted. "My parents died last year influenza. They left me their farm in Kansas, but I couldn't manage it alone. I sold it and came here hoping for a new start." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. The mountains can be a good place for a fresh beginning. "Is that why you're here?" Arabella asked before she could stop herself. "Looking for a new start?" A shadow crossed his face. "Something like that." He stood abruptly, taking her empty bowl. "You should rest. Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." "Oh, I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Xavier said firmly. "You're exhausted and still recovering from the cold. The bed isn't much, but it's better than the floor." Arabella wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was indeed weighing heavily on her. "Thank you," she said instead. You're very kind, Mr. Irving Xavier. He gave her a look that suggested kind wasn't a word often applied to him. Get some sleep, Miss Sinclair. We'll figure out how to get you back to Silverton in the morning. Arabella nodded and moved to the small bed. The sheets were rough but clean, and the mattress, though thin, was a welcome relief for her tired body. She lay down, pulling the blanket tight around her, and watched as Xavier spread his bedroll on the floor near the fire. Good night, she whispered. Night, he replied, his back to her as he stoked the fire one last time. As Arabella drifted toward sleep, she found herself studying the silhouette of the man who had saved her. There was something about Xavier Irving, something beyond his rugged good looks and gruff manner, that intrigued her. Perhaps it was the sadness she glimpsed in his eyes, or the gentleness that belied his rough exterior. Whatever it was, Arabella fell asleep with a strange certainty that finding this lonely cabin in the wilderness wasn't merely a stroke of luck. It felt almost like fate. Morning arrived with soft golden light filtering through the cabin's single window. Arabella blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by her unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, clutching the blanket to her chest. Xavier was already awake, sitting at the small table cleaning what appeared to be a hunting rifle. He looked up as she stirred. Your clothes should be dry, he said by way of greeting, nodding toward her dress and petticoats which now hung on a makeshift line near the dying embers of the fire. Thank you, Arabella replied, suddenly acutely aware of her state of undress beneath the blanket. Would you mind? Xavier understood immediately. I'll check the perimeter while you get dressed, he said, setting aside the rifle and standing. There's water in the basin if you want to wash up. He left without another word, the door closing firmly behind him. Arabella moved quickly, grateful for the privacy. Her clothes were indeed dry, though they bore the evidence of her ordeal in the form of dirt stains and small tears. She dressed as best she could, using the cold water in the basin to wash her face and hands. She had just finished pinning up her hair when Xavier returned, carrying an armful of firewood. He paused when he saw her standing there, fully dressed with her hair neatly arranged despite the lack of proper tools. You look, he began, then cleared his throat. Better. You look better than last night. Arabella couldn't help but smile at his awkwardness. Thank you. I feel much better, thanks to your hospitality. Xavier nodded and moved to the fireplace, beginning to build a new fire. I'll make some coffee, then we can discuss getting you back to town. How far are we from Silverton? Arabella asked, moving to help him with the fire, but he waved her away. About 15 miles as the crow flies, but the terrain makes it closer to 20 on foot or horseback. He struck a match and touched it to the kindling, which caught quickly. Too far to walk in those boots of yours. Arabella glanced down at her impractical footwear and grimaced. They were my only option when I arrived out west. I haven't had the funds to purchase anything more suitable. Xavier grunted, a sound that might have been sympathetic. I have a horse. I can take you back. The offer hung in the air between them. Arabella knew she should accept immediately. It was the sensible thing to do. Her aunt would be worried sick, and every moment she spent alone with a strange man compromised her reputation further. But something made her hesitate. Something about Xavier Irving and his isolated existence called to her, awakening a curiosity she couldn't explain. What do you do out here? She asked instead of accepting. All alone, I mean. Xavier looked up from the fire, surprise flashing across his features. I hunt, trap, do odd jobs for the mining companies when I need extra money. He rose to his feet, dusting his hands on his pants. I keep to myself. Don't you get lonely? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Xavier turned away, busying himself with preparing the coffee pot. Got used to it, he said finally. People complicate things. Arabella moved to the table, sitting in the single chair. Is that why you live so far from town? to avoid complications. Xavier set the coffee pot on the fire before facing her. You ask a lot of questions, Miss Sinclair. Arabella, she corrected. And yes, I've been told that before. My father said my curiosity would either be my greatest strength or lead me to disaster. She smiled ruefully. So far, the evidence suggests the latter. To her surprise, Xavier's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Your wandering yesterday wasn't your smartest decision. No, Arabella agreed. But it did lead me here, so perhaps my father was right about curiosity being a strength after all. Xavier studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes intense. You're an unusual woman, Arabella Sinclair. I'll take that as a compliment, she replied, holding his gaze. Something passed between them then, a quiet understanding that neither could articulate. Xavier broke the connection first, turning back to check on the coffee. We should leave within the hour if we want to reach Silverton before dark, he said, his voice deliberately neutral. The storm's passed, but the trails will be muddy and slow going. Arabella nodded, trying to ignore the strange disappointment that washed over her at the thought of returning to town. Yes, of course. My aunt will be beside herself with worry. Your aunt, Xavier repeated, pouring the coffee into 2 tin cups. She's your only family now?
Yes.
My mother's sister, Harriet. She's a widow herself. Uncle Thomas died in the war. She owns a small boarding house in Silverton. Arabella accepted the cup he offered. She's been kind enough to take me in while I find my footing. Xavier sat on the edge of his bed, cradling his own cup. And what are your plans? Once you've found your footing? The question caught Arabella off guard. It was the same one her aunt asked frequently, and one she still didn't have a good answer for. I'm not entirely sure, she admitted. I have enough money from the sale of the farm to last a while, but not forever. I thought perhaps I might find work as a teacher, or maybe help my aunt with the boarding house. Is that what you want? Xavier asked, his gaze penetrating. To be a teacher or an innkeeper's assistant? Arabella looked down at her coffee. It's what's available to a woman alone in the world. That didn't answer my question. She sighed. No, it's not what I want. What I want. She trailed off, then met his eyes again. What I want is to find somewhere that feels like home again. Somewhere I belong. Xavier held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded as if she'd confirmed something he already suspected. Drink your coffee, he said softly. We've got a long ride ahead. An hour later, they were mounted on Xavier's sturdy bay gelding, Arabella seated behind Xavier with her arms cautiously around his waist. The horse, which Xavier called Rusty, seemed unbothered by the double burden as they picked their way down the mountain trail. The day was clear and bright after the storm, the air washed clean and scented with pine. Under different circumstances, Arabella might have enjoyed the magnificent scenery, the soaring peaks, the verdant valleys, the occasional waterfall tumbling down a rocky face. But her mind was too full of conflicting emotions to properly appreciate the beauty around her. How did you end up in these mountains? She asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. The question had been burning in her mind since the previous night. Xavier was quiet for so long that Arabella thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. I was a deputy marshal in Denver. 4 years ago, I was tasked with escorting a prisoner to Pueblo for trial. Man named Reeves, murderer, thief, all-around bastard. Xavier paused, his body tensing slightly beneath her hands. We were ambushed in a pass not far from here. Reeves had friends organize the whole thing. They killed my partner, shot me twice, and left me for dead. Arabella gasped softly, unconsciously tightening her grip on his waist. How did you survive? Mountain Man found me, nursed me back to health in his cabin, the one you stayed in last night. He died the winter after. Left the place to me. Xavier adjusted his hat against the sun's glare. By then, I'd lost my taste for lawman's work. decided to stay in the mountains. And Reeves? His friends. Never caught, Xavier said, a hard edge creeping into his voice. I tracked them for a while, but the trail went cold.
Could be dead by now.
Could be still out there. The revelation settled between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Arabella found herself wondering if Xavier was hiding in these mountains or waiting, perhaps a bit of both. I'm sorry, she said softly, about your partner. Jim was a good man. Had a wife, 2 little girls. Xavier's voice tightened. I was best man at his wedding. Stood there and promised his bride I'd bring him home safe. Arabella rested her cheek against Xavier's back, offering silent comfort. She felt him stiffen momentarily, then gradually relax. Is that why you live alone? She asked. Because you couldn't keep your promise? Xavier didn't answer directly. People depend on you. You let them down, they get hurt. Better to keep to yourself. Arabella wanted to argue, to tell him that isolation wasn't the answer, but she sensed this wasn't the moment. Instead, she asked, do you ever go into town? When I need supplies I can't make or hunt. Every few months. And no one recognizes you? The former deputy marshal? Xavier glanced back at her. I keep my hat low and my business short. Besides, most folks aren't looking for a dead man.
Dead,
Arabella repeated, startled. Official report said both Jim and I were killed in the ambush. Easier that way, keeps my family from wondering why I never write. You have family? The question escaped before Arabella could consider its propriety. Had, Xavier corrected. Parents in Missouri. They think I died doing my duty. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. Better than knowing their son failed and ran to the mountains to hide. You didn't run, Arabella protested. You were gravely wounded, and from what you've told me, outnumbered. Doesn't change the fact that Jim's dead, and I'm not. Xavier urged Rusty around a tricky bend in the trail. And his killer's still breathing free air. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Arabella found herself trying to piece together the puzzle that was Xavier Irving, the lawman turned mountain recluse, the man whose gruff exterior couldn't quite hide his innate decency. The man who'd saved her life. Around midday, they stopped by a clear mountain stream to rest and water the horse. Xavier helped Arabella dismount, his hands strong and sure around her waist. She tried to ignore the flutter in her stomach at his touch. We're making good time, he said, leading Rusty to drink from the stream. Should reach Silverton by late afternoon. Arabella nodded, suddenly aware that their journey and her time with Xavier was more than half over. The realization brought an unexpected pang of regret. She watched as he filled a canteen from the stream, the sunlight catching on his dark hair. There was an ease to his movements, a natural grace that spoke of a man completely at home in his environment. He belonged here in these mountains in a way Arabella had never belonged anywhere, not even on her family farm in Kansas. What are you staring at? Xavier asked without turning around. Arabella blushed, embarrassed at being caught. I was just thinking.
About what?
He rose, offering her the canteen. Their fingers brushed as she took it, sending a shiver up her arm. About belonging, she said honestly. You seem so at peace here. Like you've found your place in the world. Xavier studied her, his blue eyes searching. Is that what you want?
Peace.
Arabella took a drink of the cool water, considering her answer. I want purpose, she said finally. And yes, peace. A place where I feel I'm meant to be. And you think you'll find that in Silverton? She smiled sadly. I don't know. I haven't found it anywhere else. Xavier nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. There's something I want to show you, if you're willing to delay your return by an hour or so. Curiosity immediately sparked in Arabella. What is it? Something few people ever see. He held out his hand to her. Do you trust me? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with significance beyond this moment. Arabella looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, those intense blue eyes waiting for her answer. "Yes," she said, placing her hand in his. "I trust you." Xavier's fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused. "Leave your shawl here, you won't need it where we're going." Intrigued, Arabella set her shawl on a rock and allowed Xavier to help her back onto Rusty. This time, when she wrapped her arms around his waist, it felt more natural, less tentative. They rode for about 20 minutes, leaving the main trail and following what appeared to be a game path up a steep incline. The trees grew thicker around them, the forest floor carpeted with fallen pine needles that muffled Rusty's hoofbeats. Just when Arabella was beginning to wonder if they were truly lost, the trees opened up suddenly, revealing a small, hidden meadow nestled in a natural bowl between mountain peaks. Arabella gasped at the sight. The meadow was blanketed with wildflowers, purple lupins, bright red Indian paintbrush, golden sunflowers, and dozens of other varieties she couldn't name. A small, crystal-clear pool fed by a bubbling spring occupied one corner, reflecting the blue sky above. Xavier dismounted and helped her down, watching her face as she took in the breathtaking scene. "It's beautiful," she whispered, afraid speaking too loudly might somehow break the spell of this magical place. "The old mountain man who saved me brought me here when I was strong enough to ride," Xavier said, his voice soft with memory. "Said places like this were God's reminder that there's still beauty in the world, even after the worst happens." Arabella looked at him, touched by the sentiment and the fact that he'd chosen to share this special place with her. "Thank you for showing me this," she said. Xavier nodded, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. "I come here when the cabin starts to feel too small, when the memories get too loud." Without thinking, Arabella reached out and took his hand. "And does it help, being here?" "Sometimes." His thumb moved gently across her knuckles, a gesture so slight she might have imagined it. "Some wounds take longer to heal than others." They stood there, hand in hand, surrounded by wildflowers and the distant song of birds. Arabella felt something shift between them, a subtle change in the air, in the way Xavier looked at her, in the way her heart quickened at his touch. "We should go," Xavier said finally, though he made no move to release her hand. "Your aunt will be worried." "Yes," Arabella agreed, equally reluctant to break the moment. "We should." Neither of them moved. Instead, Xavier took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Arabella," he said, her name sounding different somehow in his voice. "I don't make a habit of rescuing lost women in the mountains." She smiled. "I should hope not." It would be a concerning pattern. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "What I mean is, I'm not sure why I opened my door last night. I usually avoid any contact with strangers." "Perhaps you heard my desperate pleas and took pity," Arabella suggested, trying to lighten his suddenly serious mood. Xavier shook his head. "I've ignored desperate pleas before. Hunters who stray too close to my territory, prospectors looking for shelter. I let them find their own way."
Oh.
Arabella wasn't sure how to respond to this confession. "Then why did you help me?" Xavier looked away, across the meadow of wildflowers. "I saw you through the window, a woman alone, drenched from the rain, looking like you'd been through hell." His eyes returned to hers. "And something told me to open the door. Something I haven't felt in a long time." Arabella's heart pounded in her chest. "What was that?"
"Hope," he said simply.
The word hung between them, full of meaning and possibility. Before Arabella could respond, Xavier leaned down and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was soft, hesitant, the kiss of a man who had forgotten what it meant to be close to another person. Arabella responded instinctively, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palm. When they broke apart, Xavier looked as stunned as she felt, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. "I shouldn't have," he began. "I'm glad you did," Arabella interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. Xavier studied her face, searching for any sign of discomfort or regret. Finding none, he slowly raised a hand to her cheek, his touch feather-light. "You're heading back to Silverton," he reminded her, his voice rough with emotion. "To your aunt, to your life." "Yes," she acknowledged, leaning slightly into his touch. "But I don't know if that's where I'm meant to be." Xavier's eyes darkened. "What are you saying, Arabella?" She took a deep breath, hardly believing her own daring. "I'm saying that for the first time since my parents died, I feel awake, alive. And it's not because of Silverton or my aunt's boarding house. It's because you nearly died on a mountain," Xavier said, but there was no conviction in his words. Arabella shook her head, a smile playing at her lips. "It's because I found you."
Or you found me. Does it matter which?
Xavier's expression grew serious again. "I live alone, Arabella. I've chosen this life for a reason." "Because you blame yourself for your partner's death," she said gently. "Because you think isolation is your punishment." He flinched as if she'd struck him. "You don't understand. I understand loss," Arabella said firmly. "I understand guilt. My mother fell ill first. I nursed her, then caught the influenza myself. By the time I recovered enough to care for my father, it was too late." Tears pricked at her eyes. "So yes, Xavier, I understand what it means to blame yourself for something beyond your control." Xavier was silent, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not asking for promises," Arabella continued. "I'm not even sure what I'm asking for. All I know is that when you kissed me just now, it felt right. It felt like finding something I didn't know I was looking for." Slowly, deliberately, Xavier pulled her closer. "You're a dangerous woman, Arabella Sinclair," he murmured. "Why is that?" she whispered. "Because you make me want things I've denied myself for 4 years." His hand slid to the nape of her neck, fingers threading through her hair. "You make me want to hope again." This time when they kissed, there was nothing hesitant about it. Xavier's mouth claimed hers with a hunger that matched the fire igniting in her veins. Arabella wound her arms around his neck, pressing herself against him as if she could somehow fuse their bodies together. It was Xavier who finally broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers as they both caught their breath. "We should get you back to town," he said, though his arms remained firmly around her waist. "Before I forget myself completely." Arabella nodded, reluctantly stepping back from his embrace. The real world was waiting her aunt, the boarding house, all the practical concerns she had momentarily forgotten in the magic of this hidden meadow. "Will you come to Silverton?" she asked as Xavier led Rusty back to them. "To visit, I mean?" Xavier hesitated. "I don't mix well with town folk." "You mix well enough with me," Arabella pointed out. A slow smile spread across his face, the first full, genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, erasing years of solitude and grief. "That I do," he agreed, helping her mount. "That I do." As they rode out of the meadow, Arabella leaned her cheek against Xavier's back, breathing in the scent of him pine, leather, and something uniquely his own. She didn't know what would happen when they reached Silverton, or in the days and weeks to come. But for the first time in over a year, she felt something like hope blossoming in her chest. The sun was low in the western sky when they finally crested the last ridge and Silverton came into view. The small mining town nestled in the valley below, its buildings looking like miniatures from this distance. "There it is," Xavier said, bringing Rusty to a halt. "Your aunt's house is on the eastern edge of town?" "Yes," Arabella confirmed, her heart sinking at the realization that their journey was almost over. The white 2-story with a blue trim. Xavier nodded and urged Rusty forward, down the winding trail that would lead them into town. Arabella tightened her arms around his waist, savoring these last moments of closeness. "Xavier," she said after a while, "what happens now?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "I don't know, Arabella. I've been alone a long time. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else." "You don't have to decide everything now," she said, resting her cheek against his shoulder. "Just promise you won't disappear." Xavier reached down and squeezed her hand where it rested against his abdomen. "I won't disappear," he promised. "But I can't promise more than that. Not yet." It would have to be enough, Arabella decided. They had found something unexpected in that mountain cabin, a connection neither had been looking for. Whatever came next, she wouldn't let it slip away without a fight. As they approached the outskirts of Silverton, Arabella could feel Xavier tensing beneath her hands. His shoulders straightened, his posture became more vigilant. He was transforming back into the cautious, guarded man who kept the world at arm's length. "You could let me off here," she suggested, understanding his discomfort. "I can walk the rest of the way." Xavier shook his head firmly. "I'm seeing you safely to your door, Arabella. I gave my word." They rode down the main street of Silverton, drawing curious glances from the townsfolk. Arabella was acutely aware of how they must look, her dress dirty and torn, her hair coming loose from its pins, seated intimately behind a rough-looking mountain man. "That's my aunt's boarding house," she said, pointing to the neat white building at the end of the street. As they approached, the front door flew open, and a slender woman in her 50s rushed out onto the porch. "Arabella," she cried, her face a mixture of relief and anger. "Where on earth have you been? I've had search parties out looking for you since yesterday." Xavier brought Rusty to a halt in front of the house and dismounted before helping Arabella down. Her legs felt unsteady after the long ride, and she stumbled slightly. Xavier's hand on her elbow steadied her. "Aunt Harriet," Arabella said, moving forward to embrace the older woman. "I'm so sorry to have worried you. I got lost in the mountains when the storm hit." Harriet Sinclair held her niece at arm's length, examining her for injuries. "Are you hurt? What happened to your dress?" Her gaze shifted suspiciously to Xavier, who stood a respectful distance away, hat in hand. "And who is this man?" "This is Xavier Irving," Arabella said, motioning him forward. "He found me lost in the darkness and gave me shelter. Then he brought me safely home. I owe him my life, Aunt Harriet." Harriet's expression softened slightly. "Is this true, Mr. Irving?" Xavier nodded, looking uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Yes, madam. Miss Sinclair was in a bad way when she found my cabin. I couldn't in good conscience leave her to fend for herself." "Then I am in your debt, sir," Harriet said, inclining her head graciously. "Please, won't you come in? You must be tired and hungry after your journey. I insist you stay for dinner at least." Xavier shifted his weight, clearly torn between the desire to flee back to his mountain sanctuary and the demands of politeness. "Thank you, madam, but I should start back before dark." "Nonsense," Harriet interrupted firmly. "I won't hear of it. You've had a long ride, and your horse needs rest. We have a perfectly good stable out back, and I always keep a room ready for travelers. You'll stay the night and start fresh in the morning." Xavier looked to Arabella, who gave him an encouraging smile. "My aunt is notoriously stubborn, Xavier. It's easier to give in gracefully." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I see where you get it from," he murmured, too low for Harriet to hear. "Very well, Mrs. Sinclair," he said more loudly. "I accept your hospitality with gratitude." "Excellent," Harriet said, looking pleased. "Now, Arabella, you must go upstairs and change immediately. You look positively wild." She turned to Xavier. "Mr. Irving, there's a pump out back where you can wash up, and I'll have my handyman Thomas show you where to stable your horse." As Harriet bustled back inside to make the necessary arrangements, Arabella moved closer to Xavier. Thank you for agreeing to stay, she said softly. I know it's not what you wanted. Xavier's eyes were warm as they met hers. It seems I'm developing a habit of doing things I never thought I would, he replied, his voice equally low. All because of a woman who got lost in the mountains. Before Arabella could respond, Harriet reappeared with a weathered older man who she introduced as Thomas, the handyman. Xavier nodded politely and followed him around the side of the house, leading Rusty. Now, Harriet said, linking her arm through Arabella's and guiding her inside, you must tell me everything. And I do mean everything, my dear. Arabella allowed herself to be led upstairs to her small bedroom, where her aunt helped her out of her ruined dress and into a clean one, all while peppering her with questions about her ordeal and her rescuer. He seems an unusual sort of man, Harriet commented as she brushed out Arabella's tangled hair. Educated, from his speech, but with the look of someone who's spent years in the wilderness. He's a former deputy marshal, Arabella explained, deciding honesty was the best approach. He was injured in an ambush several years ago and chose to live in the mountains afterward. Harriet's hands paused in their work. A lawman turned hermit? How very curious. And how fortunate that you stumbled upon his cabin. Yes, Arabella agreed softly. Very fortunate. Harriet resumed brushing, her strokes more thoughtful. He's quite handsome, in a rugged sort of way. Arabella felt her cheeks warm. Is he? I hadn't noticed. Her aunt's reflection in the mirror raised a skeptical eyebrow. My dear, I may be older, but I'm not blind. Nor am I oblivious to the way you look at him, or the way he looks at you, for that matter. Aunt Harriet. Arabella protested, her blush deepening. Oh, don't play the innocent with me, Harriet said, though her tone was kind. Something happened between you two out there in those mountains, didn't it? Arabella met her aunt's eyes in the mirror, considering how much to reveal. Harriet had always been more understanding than most women of her generation, having married for love rather than convenience. We connected, Arabella admitted finally. In a way I can't quite explain. It's as if we recognized something in each other. Harriet nodded, securing Arabella's hair with pins. Sometimes the heart knows what it wants before the head has time to argue. She patted her niece's shoulder. But be careful, my dear. Men who choose isolation often have wounds that run deep. I know, Arabella said softly, but perhaps those are the wounds most in need of healing. Harriet studied her niece's face for a moment, then smiled. You always did have a gentle heart, just like your mother. She straightened, becoming practical once more. Now, come downstairs. I've asked Martha to prepare a special dinner to celebrate your safe return. When Arabella entered the dining room 30 minutes later, she found Xavier already seated at the long table, freshly washed and looking decidedly uncomfortable among the other boarders who were regarding him with undisguised curiosity. He rose when she appeared, his eyes warming at the sight of her. Miss Sinclair, he said formally, pulling out the chair beside his. You look much improved. Thank you, Mr. Irving, she replied, matching his formal tone while shooting him a private smile. A proper bath and clean clothes can work wonders. Dinner was a lively affair, with the other boarders 2 mining engineers, a clerk from the assayer's office, and a widow who taught at the local school eager to hear about Arabella's adventure and Xavier's mountain existence. To Arabella's surprise, Xavier handled the attention with more grace than she expected, answering questions politely if sometimes tersely. And you truly live completely alone up there, Mr. Irving? Mrs. Porter, the widow, asked with a mixture of horror and fascination. Without any of the comforts of civilization? I have what I need, Xavier replied. Shelter, food, quiet. But no company, she persisted. No conversation or companionship. Doesn't the solitude drive you to distraction? Xavier's eyes briefly met Arabella's before he answered. Solitude has its advantages, madam. But I admit there are times when the cabin feels emptier than it should. After dinner, while the other boarders retired to the parlor for coffee, Arabella found herself alone with Xavier on the front porch. The night was clear, the sky ablaze with stars, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. "Thank you for enduring that," Arabella said, leaning against the porch railing. "I know it can't have been easy for you, answering all those questions." Xavier shrugged, moving to stand beside her. "Your aunt has been kind. It seemed the least I could do." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the few townspeople still out and about on the street. "I've been thinking," Xavier said finally, his voice low, "about what you said in the meadow." Arabella's heart quickened. "What part specifically?" "About finding something you didn't know you were looking for." He turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight spilling from the window. "I've spent 4 years hiding from the world, Arabella. Convinced myself I was better off alone. Then you appeared at my door, and in less than a day, you've made me question everything." Arabella took a step closer to him. "Is that a bad thing?" "I don't know," he admitted. "It's unsettling, but not entirely unwelcome." She smiled, encouraged by his honesty. "What are you going to do about it?" Xavier ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was coming to recognize as a sign of his inner conflict. "I can't simply abandon my life in the mountains. It's where I belong." "I understand that," Arabella said, though the words brought a pang of disappointment. "I wouldn't ask you to give up your home." Xavier studied her face, his eyes searching. "What would you ask of me, Arabella?" It was a loaded question, one that required more courage than she thought she possessed. But something about this man, his quiet strength, his hidden tenderness, gave her the bravery to speak her mind. "I would ask for a chance," she said softly. "A chance to see if what we felt in the mountains was real or merely the product of extraordinary circumstances." Xavier reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And how would we do that?" "I could visit your cabin," Arabella suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or you could come to town occasionally. We could write letters." She smiled ruefully. "I'm making this up as I go along, Xavier. I've never done anything like this before." "Neither have I," he confessed, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "But I find myself willing to try if you are." Arabella nodded, her heart too full for words. Xavier's hand slid from her shoulder to the nape of her neck, drawing her closer. "Your aunt might not approve," he murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips. "My aunt is watching us through the window right now," Arabella whispered back, "and I guarantee she approves entirely." Xavier glanced over her shoulder and chuckled.
"So she is."
He looked back at Arabella, his expression growing serious again. "I make no promises, Arabella. I don't know if I remember how to be part of someone else's life." "I'm not asking for promises," she repeated. "Just for time. Time to see where this leads." Xavier nodded slowly. "Time, I can give you." He leaned down and pressed a soft, brief kiss to her lips. "And perhaps, with time, I can offer more." It was a beginning tentative and uncertain, but real. As Arabella stood on that porch under the vast Colorado sky, she felt something settle in her soul. She had come west looking for a new start, a place to belong. She hadn't expected to find it in the arms of a solitary mountain man with haunted eyes and a wounded heart. But life, she was discovering, rarely followed the paths one expected. Sometimes you had to get lost in the darkness to find your way to the light. 3 months passed, each day bringing new developments in Arabella and Xavier's unconventional courtship. True to his word, Xavier began making more frequent trips to Silverton, usually staying a night or two at Harriet's boarding house before returning to his mountain sanctuary. During these visits, he and Arabella would walk through town, dine together, and spend long evenings in conversation on the boarding house porch. The townsfolk soon grew accustomed to the sight of the refined young woman and her rugged companion, though speculation about their relationship ran rampant through Silverton. Arabella, for her part, visited Xavier's cabin twice, each time chaperoned by her aunt, who had taken a surprising liking to the former lawman. These visits allowed Arabella to see Xavier in his element, hunting, tracking, living with the land in a way few modern men did. She admired his self-sufficiency and the peace he seemed to find in his solitary existence, even as she gently encouraged him to reconnect with the wider world. It was during her second visit to the cabin, as summer gave way to early autumn, that Arabella found herself sitting beside Xavier on a fallen log near the edge of his property, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and crimson. "I received a letter yesterday," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "From the school board." Xavier glanced at her, eyebrows raised in question. "The teaching position you applied for?" Arabella nodded, a mixture of excitement and nervousness fluttering in her stomach. "They've offered it to me, starting next month, when Mrs. Porter retires." A slow smile spread across Xavier's face, warming his blue eyes. "Congratulations. You'll make an excellent teacher." "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "It means I'll be staying in Silverton permanently." Xavier's gaze returned to the sunset, his expression thoughtful. "I figured as much when you applied for the position. Does that change anything? Between us, I mean." Arabella held her breath, still uncertain where she stood with this complex man despite the deepening connection they shared. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his profile etched against the dying light. "It changes things," he finally said, "but not in the way you might think." He turned to face her fully, taking her hand in his. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past months, Arabella, about my life, about what happened with Jim, about what kind of future I want." Arabella squeezed his hand encouragingly, her heart pounding. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I've been punishing myself for something that wasn't entirely my fault," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That I've been hiding from life instead of living it." His eyes locked with hers. "And that meeting you was the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time." Tears pricked at Arabella's eyes. "Xavier, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not good with words, and I need to say this right." He took a deep breath. "I don't think I can go back to living completely alone, Arabella. Not anymore. Not since you showed up at my door that night and reminded me what it means to care about someone." Hope bloomed in Arabella's chest. "What are you saying?" Xavier's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I'm saying I want to build something with you. Something real and lasting." He smiled, a hint of his old uncertainty showing through. "I'm not suggesting I move to town, not yet anyway. But perhaps a compromise." "What kind of compromise?" Arabella asked, hardly daring to believe where this conversation was heading. "There's good land about halfway between my cabin and Silverton. Close enough for you to reach the school each day, far enough out to give me the space I still need." Xavier's eyes searched hers. "I thought perhaps we could build something there. Together." Arabella stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Xavier Irving," she finally managed, "are you asking me to marry you?" A flush crept up his neck, but his gaze remained steady. "In my own roundabout way, yes, I believe I am." He squeezed her hand. "I love you, Arabella Sinclair. I didn't plan to, didn't expect to, but there it is. And if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve." Tears spilled freely down Arabella's cheeks now. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Xavier, I'll have you. I love you too." Xavier's face transformed with joy as he pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I can't promise it will be easy," he warned. "I've been alone a long time. I have rough edges." Arabella smiled, cupping his face in her hands. And I have patience. And love. More than enough of both. From the cabin doorway, Harriet cleared her throat discreetly. I hate to interrupt what appears to be a significant moment, she called, amusement evident in her voice, but supper is ready, and the temperature is dropping with the sun. Xavier chuckled, helping Arabella to her feet. We're coming, Mrs. Sinclair, he called back. Then, more quietly to Arabella, I suppose we should tell her our news. She'll be thrilled, Arabella assured him, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. She's been hoping for this since the day you brought me home. As they walked back to the cabin together, Arabella couldn't help but marvel at how completely her life had changed in just a few months. She had come to Colorado lost and adrift, uncertain of her future and her place in the world. Now she had purpose, belonging, and most precious of all, love. All because she had gotten lost in the mountains without a light. The wedding took place on a crisp October day, with the aspen trees glowing gold against the evergreen backdrop of the mountains. It was a small affair, held in Silverton's modest church with only Harriet, a few close friends from town, and the circuit riding minister in attendance. Arabella wore a simple ivory dress that Harriet had helped her make, with tiny wildflowers woven into her upswept hair, a reminder of the meadow where she and Xavier had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. Xavier, for his part, had purchased a new suit for the occasion, looking both handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal attire. You clean up rather well, Mr. Irving, Arabella whispered as they stood side by side at the altar. Enjoy it while it lasts, Miss Sinclair, he murmured back, a smile playing at his lips. It's back to buckskins tomorrow. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier surprised everyone, Arabella most of all, by sweeping her into a passionate kiss that drew cheers from the small congregation. What happened to my reserved mountain man? She asked breathlessly when he finally released her. Xavier's eyes sparkled with uncharacteristic mischief. He found something worth coming down from the mountain for. The reception was held at Harriet's boarding house, where the dining room had been transformed with autumn flowers and ribbons. The other boarders and a few townspeople joined them for a celebratory meal, toasting the unlikely couple with genuine warmth. Never thought I'd see the day, Thomas, the handyman, remarked to Xavier over glasses of whiskey. You struck me as a confirmed bachelor when you first rode in with Miss Arabella, I mean, Mrs. Irving now. Xavier's gaze found Arabella across the room, where she was laughing with her aunt and Mrs. Porter. Life has a way of surprising you, he said simply. As the celebration wound down and twilight settled over Silverton, Xavier approached Harriet, who was directing the cleanup efforts with her usual efficiency. Mrs. Sinclair, he said, offering her a small wrapped package. Arabella, and I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for us. Harriet looked surprised. This isn't necessary, Xavier. Seeing Arabella happy is thanks enough. Nevertheless, he insisted. Please. She unwrapped the package to reveal a delicately carved wooden jewelry box, its lid inlaid with a pattern of mountain wildflowers. It's beautiful, she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Did you make this? Xavier nodded, a touch of color in his cheeks. It's a poor repayment for giving me your blessing to marry your niece, but it comes with my promise to take care of her always. Harriet reached up and patted his cheek, her eyes misty. I know you will, my boy. I knew it from the moment you brought her home that first day. She smiled. Now, go find your wife. I believe she's waiting for you on the porch. Arabella was indeed on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill, her face turned up to the emerging stars. She smiled as Xavier joined her, leaning naturally into his embrace when he slipped an arm around her waist. Happy? He asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Completely, she assured him. Are you ready to go home? Home. The word held new meaning now. No longer a solitary cabin or a rented room, but a shared future they were building together. True to his word, Xavier had purchased land midway between Silverton and his mountain retreat. Over the past 2 months, with help from friends in town, they had constructed a modest but comfortable cabin there, close enough to town for Arabella to reach the school each day by horseback, remote enough to satisfy Xavier's need for space and quiet. "I'm ready," Xavier confirmed, offering his arm. "I've had about all the socializing I can handle for one day." Arabella laughed, linking her arm through his. "You were magnificent," she assured him. "No one would have guessed how much you were longing to escape back to the wilderness." They said their goodbyes to Harriet and the remaining guests, then mounted the horses waiting for them, Rusty for Xavier and a gentle mare named Daisy that he had purchased for Arabella. Side by side, they rode out of town as darkness settled fully over the land. The journey to their new home took about an hour, with Xavier leading the way along trails that were becoming familiar to Arabella. When they finally crested the last rise and saw the cabin below, lamplight glowing warmly in its windows thanks to Thomas, who had ridden ahead to prepare for their arrival, Arabella felt a surge of emotion. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Our own little piece of the world." Xavier dismounted and helped her down, holding her close for a moment longer than necessary. "It's just a beginning," he said, his voice husky with feeling. "But it's ours." Hand in hand, they walked toward their new home, toward the future they would build together, a future neither had imagined possible just a few months earlier when a storm had driven a lost young woman to a lonely cabin door. As they crossed the threshold, Xavier paused, turning to face his bride. "I never told you," he said, "what I thought that night when I saw you standing outside my cabin." "What did you think?" Arabella asked, curious. Xavier's eyes, so often guarded, were open and vulnerable as they met hers. "I thought you were a vision, something my lonely mind had conjured from the storm. And then I thought, if you were real, if you had truly found your way to me." He traced the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "That would be enough. More than enough. It would be everything." Arabella's heart swelled with love as she rose on tiptoe to kiss him. "I was lost," she whispered against his lips. "But now I'm found." Xavier swept her into his arms, carrying her over the threshold into their new life together. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irving," he said. "Welcome home." And as the door closed behind them, both knew they had finally found what they had been searching for, not just a place to belong, but a person to belong with. In each other's arms, they had discovered the truest meaning of home. 5 years later, Arabella stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar hues of gold and crimson. The sound of laughter drew her gaze to the small garden where Xavier was teaching their 4-year-old son James how to plant corn seeds. "Not so deep, Jamie," she heard him say, his voice filled with the patience he reserved for their children. "Just like I showed you." "Like this, Papa?" the boy asked, his small face serious with concentration. "Perfect," Xavier affirmed, ruffling the boy's dark hair, so like his own. From inside the cabin came the sound of their 2-year-old daughter Hannah babbling to her rag doll as Harriet, who had moved in with them after selling the boarding house last year, prepared dinner. Arabella smiled, contentment washing over her like a warm wave. Their life wasn't grand or exciting by society's standards. Xavier still spent days hunting and trapping, though now he sold his furs and meat in Silverton rather than using them solely for his own survival. Arabella continued teaching at the school, bringing the children with her 3 days a week and leaving them with Harriet the other 2. They had created a unique balance, not fully part of town life, not completely isolated in the wilderness, but somewhere in between that suited them both perfectly. Xavier looked up and caught her watching them. He smiled, an easy, natural expression that had become more frequent over the years, and whispered something to Jamie. The boy turned and waved enthusiastically. "Mama, come see my seeds." Arabella laughed and descended the porch steps, crossing the yard to join her family. Xavier straightened as she approached, wrapping an arm around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing between them. "How is school today?" he asked, his blue eyes no longer haunted, filled with genuine interest.
"Productive," she replied.
The older children are preparing for their examinations, and the younger ones are finally grasping their letters. She smiled down at their son. "Jamie might be ready to start next year if he keeps practicing." "I can write my name," the boy announced proudly. "And count to 20. 21, Xavier corrected with mock seriousness. "You forgot 15 yesterday." Jamie giggled. 21. Arabella watched the exchange with a full heart. Xavier had taken to fatherhood with surprising ease, his initial awkwardness around the tiny, fragile beings they had created giving way to confidence and deep devotion. The birth of their son, named for Xavier's fallen partner, had been a turning point, a healing of old wounds, a fulfillment of an unspoken promise. "Supper's nearly ready," she told them. "We should wash up." As they walked back to the cabin together, Jamie running ahead to tell his grandmother about the seeds he had planted, Xavier slowed his pace, keeping Arabella at his side. "I rode past the old cabin today," he said quietly. "First time in almost a year." Arabella looked up at him, understanding the significance. The mountain cabin where they had first met remained standing, occasionally used by Xavier when he went on extended hunting trips, but largely abandoned in favor of their family home. "How is it?" she asked. "Quiet," he said with a slight smile. "Peaceful." He met her gaze. "Empty." Arabella squeezed his hand, knowing what he was really saying. "Do you miss it?" "The solitude." Xavier shook his head, his eyes never leaving hers. "Not for a moment." He glanced toward the cabin, where their children's voices could be heard, mingling with Harriet's calmer tones. "How could I miss silence when I have all this music?" Arabella stood on tiptoe to kiss him, this man who had transformed from a solitary, wounded soul into a loving husband and father. "I love you, Xavier Irving," she whispered against his lips. "More every day." "And I love you," he replied, the words coming easily now after years of practice. "For finding me in the darkness, for being my light." As they entered their home, greeted by the chaos and joy of family life, Arabella thought back to that stormy night when she had stumbled upon a lonely cabin in the wilderness. Lost, afraid, without a light to guide her way. She had found so much more than shelter that night. She had found her future, her partner, her home. And in the years since, she and Xavier had built a life together that neither could have imagined possible when they first met, a life filled with love, family, and the quiet understanding that sometimes getting lost is the only way to truly be found.